Hi. Are you getting tired of disasters? Whether you might feel like your life is a disaster or you see disasters play out across the world, we see problems before us today in the midst of the coronavirus, in the midst of racial tension, whatever it might be. Maybe you have something going on in your life, and it begs the question of Christians and non-Christians. Where is God in the midst of disaster? And who is the church really called to be when we experience one disaster after another? Hey, my name is Stephanie Norton. I'm the pastor here at Hartford United Methodist Church, and this is the sermon recap for Sunday, June 7th, 2020, where we tackled that issue of disaster. What does the Bible say about disaster? What do we learn from that? Well, we see in the Bible, across the span of history, that there are three different types of disaster. Two of them are very common. We see man-made disasters, and that's like if I get drunk and I drive a car and I crash into a picnic table full of people and I hurt them or injure them or kill them. That's a man-made disaster. Another type of disaster is a natural disaster, like hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes. There's a third kind of disaster that we need to be very careful with, that sometimes people call the Old Testament disaster. And God enters into a covenant relationship with the Jewish people. He tells a man named Abraham, he says, through you and your descendants, I'm going to change the world. I'm going to reach the entire world through you. And he tells Abraham, you're going to have so many descendants, they'll be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the grains of sand on the beach. And Abraham has many, 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 many descendants, even now to this day. And God has a covenant relationship with the Jewish people. And in this is a legal and binding contract where God and the Israelites agree to certain terms where they're going to be faithful to God, He's going to be faithful to them. But if one side or the other, if they break that covenant, then there's going to be ramifications, punishments, and repercussions for that. And so what we see again and again in the Old Testament is that the Jewish people, they fall out of a faithful relationship with God. And He allows disaster to happen when they do that. And when they repent, that means when they turn around, they realize they're doing something wrong, and they cry out to God, and they become faithful to Him again, then He saves them, He rescues them. And we see that play out again and again in the Old Testament. And there's a big problem today with people taking that Old Testament model and thinking that it applies today. And this is why it doesn't. Because we have Jesus, and He offers us a new covenant by His blood. He's explicit about that. And so it doesn't matter, you don't have to be Jewish, it doesn't matter what nation you live in, what language you speak, if you're a man or a woman, what color you are, how tall or short you are. Jesus' covenant is for everybody, anyone who wants it. And so Jesus breaks that Old Testament covenant cycle, and we have a new relationship in Him. And in Jesus, we get to answer the question, where is God in the midst of disaster? So when Jesus arrives on earth, God in human flesh, when Jesus arrives, we see that He ministers to people in the midst of disaster. And that tells us that's exactly where God's heart is. When Jesus encounters people who are hungry, He feeds them. If He sees people who are ill, who are injured, who are hurting and suffering, He heals them. He ministers to them. If He sees people who need to be educated and taught, then He does that. He is a servant. He has a servant's heart. And He helps people in the midst of disaster. He corrects, He rights all those wrongs. That's where God's heart is. In the disaster that you're encountering today, whatever it may be, if it's personal or if you're watching things play out on the national scale or the world scale, that's where God's heart is. It's for the people who are suffering. It's for the most vulnerable. And so then it brings us to, well, where's the church in the time of disaster? In the midst of disaster, we are called to be as Christ-like as possible. Actually, that's our job all the time. But if we think Jesus would minister to this hurting person, then that's exactly what we're supposed to do in the midst of disaster. He role models for us what we're supposed to be. He was a servant, so we're supposed to be servants. He was loving, and we are supposed to be loving. The Apostle Paul writes in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, that God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, Instead, he's given us the spirit of power, love, and self-discipline. So whatever disaster you are fearful of, I'm asking you to lay that aside and to take up the spirit that is filled with power, that is encompassed, poured over in love, and that is self-disciplined, so that whether you're experiencing a disaster or you're witnessing another person's disaster, you can be a servant. You can be Christ-like in that moment. And you can shower them with love. You can use the power that you have personally to make that disaster, instead of wrong, you make it right again. And you're self-disciplined in knowing when to exercise those to the benefit of the children of God. I hope this message has blessed you. I hope it helps you know what to do in the midst of disaster. And I hope you reach out to a church in your neighborhood, whether it's Hartford UMC in Hartford, Michigan, or wherever it is that you live. God bless you.